There's a psychological phenomenon that researchers have studied for decades, and it quietly controls some of the most important financial decisions you will ever make. It is called normalcy bias. In simple terms, it is the deeply human tendency to assume that because things have always worked a certain way, they will continue to work that way. You wake up, you go to the store, the shelves are stocked, the prices feel roughly familiar, and your brain files all of that under the category of normal. Safe, stable. Not a problem that needs to be solved today. And that assumption, that invisible mental shortcut, is exactly what economists and behavioral researchers say is the most expensive cognitive mistake a household can make in an era of sustained economic disruption. Here is what makes this so fascinating from a psychological standpoint. Normalcy bias does not feel like denial. It feels like rationality. You're not ignoring the news. You have heard about tariffs. You have seen the headlines about supply chain pressure and rising food costs and geopolitical conflict reshaping global energy markets. But your brain categorizes all of that as information rather than instruction. It processes the threat without translating it into action. The part of your mind wired for what is in front of you right now almost always wins against the part trying to calculate consequences 6 months from now. But there is something important you should understand about this moment. The price increases arriving in 2025 and 2026 are not behaving the way your brain expects price disruptions to behave. Research published by economists at the Federal Reserve found that households absorbed price hikes on electronics, appliances, clothing, and furniture with no offset from retailers or foreign exporters. The pass-through is complete, which means the prices you see today are not a spike waiting to correct. They are the new floor, and the trajectory continues upward from here. What your brain needs right now is not panic. Panic buying is itself a psychological failure mode. It is impulsive, expensive, and driven by the same emotional circuits that make people irrational under pressure. What you actually need is the calm, deliberate clarity of someone who has decided to act strategically before the urgency arrives. There are two versions of every person watching this. The version who receives information like this and processes it as one more anxiety in an already anxious world, closes the tab and returns to the comfortable assumption that someone else is managing the problem. And the version who pauses feels the weight of what is actually being described and makes a decision to do something specific about it today while the window is still open. So, what does strategic action actually look like? Start with energy independence at the household level. Kerosene prices moved sharply upward in early 2026, driven by disruptions to tanker routes through the Strait of Hormuz. A quality indoor-rated kerosene heater combined with stored kerosene in approved containers gives your home heat security that operates entirely outside the electrical grid, capable of warming a medium-sized room for 8 to 10 hours on a single gallon. This is not a doomsday purchase. It is the same logic that made your grandparents keep a full pantry. Preparation as a financial strategy, not preparation as fear. Behavioral psychology tells us something important about how humans perceive these kinds of decisions. There is a cognitive tendency called the effort heuristic, where people unconsciously assign higher value to things that feel complex or costly, and dismiss low-cost, high-impact moves as too simple to matter. A hand-crank laundry tub might strike you as absurdly simple, but in countries where electricity costs have become prohibitive, people with perfectly functioning washing machines are hand-washing their clothes because the math demands it. Concentrated powdered laundry detergent, shelf-stable for up to 2 years, is one of the highest value per gram household purchases you can make right now. Not because it is glamorous, but because it is real. The deeper psychological truth here is that resilience is almost never built from a single dramatic action. It is assembled quietly, item by item, from small decisions made before they become necessary. Beef prices rose over 14% between February 2025 and February 2026, with projections suggesting another 10% increase across 2026. A pressure canner allows you to purchase meat at today's price and convert it into shelf-stable jars lasting 2 to 5 years with no refrigeration required. That is not survivalism. That is financial arbitrage available to any household with a kitchen. What researchers who study economic disruption consistently find is that the households who navigate price shocks most successfully are not the wealthiest ones. They're the ones who made a series of quiet, unglamorous decisions early enough that disruption arrived to a home already prepared to absorb it. The food dehydrator, the vacuum sealer, the canning lids purchased before demand spiked. These are not items that signal anxiety. They are items that signal intelligence, patience, and a clear-eyed reading of publicly available economic data. Here's a reframe that might shift how you see everything described so far. The households that move through economic turbulence with the least damage are not the ones who reacted fastest when crisis arrived. They are the ones who quietly stacked capacity ahead of time, who thought about wool blankets and thermal cookers and hand tools, not as emergency supplies, but as investments in a kind of freedom. Freedom from the anxiety of dependency. freedom from the helplessness that comes from being unprepared, freedom from the particular regret that follows a decision you knew you should have made but kept postponing, because that postponement, that quiet internal negotiation where you tell yourself you will think about it later, that is normalcy bias doing exactly what it was designed by evolution to do. It is conserving cognitive energy, but it is doing so in a moment when the data actually does warrant action, and at a cost that only reveals itself later. Think of each item on a list like this as a psychological completion. Each one you acquire is not just a material object. It is a decision your future self will not have to make under pressure. It is the closing of a vulnerability before it becomes a wound. The most powerful thing you can do right now is not to panic. It is not to ignore. It is simply to decide. Decide to be the version of yourself that looked at the information clearly, felt the calm of knowing what to do, and moved with intention before the window closed. If content like this resonates with you, and you want to keep understanding not just what is happening economically, but why your mind responds the way it does to uncertainty, subscribe to Secret Fix Vault. This channel exists to give you exactly that: the insight, the calm, and the tools to move forward with confidence no matter what the world throws next.